Hey everyone, welcome to today's story. Have you ever felt lost in your own thoughts? Chasing after fame and fortune, only to realize one day that it's all just an endless cycle? Today, I want to share with you the story of Ethan, a man who was once consumed by ambition and mistakes, but after facing many hardships, he learned the power of right thinking and found his way back to himself. This isn't just Ethan's story, it could be any of ours. Join me as we follow his journey and uncover the deep lessons behind it. Ethan was once a man admired by many. He had a prestigious job, a high salary, extensive connections, and a life that others dreamed of. But deep inside, Ethan never felt satisfied. Every time he achieved a new milestone, the sense of accomplishment faded quickly, leaving behind an empty void. He would then set his sights on an even greater goal, convinced that reaching the next level would finally bring him happiness. Yet, the more he chased success, the more restless he became, constantly anxious, stressed, and afraid of losing what he had. Ethan always wanted more money, more recognition, more power. He worked tirelessly, sacrificing sleep, health, and even personal relationships. He believed that true happiness lay at the top, and only when he had it all would he finally feel fulfilled. But the reality was the opposite. Lavish parties didn't bring him joy, expensive possessions didn't satisfy him, and with every new goal he conquered, the emptiness inside him only grew larger. Over time, Ethan became irritable and impatient. He would snap at his employees for minor mistakes, lose his temper when clients didn't comply with his demands, and feel envious whenever someone else succeeded. He began to look down on people who led simple lives, thinking they were wasting their potential. But what he failed to realize was that he was the one who had lost his way. Sleepless nights, lingering anxiety, and endless drinking sessions to escape reality slowly consumed him. Despite standing in his luxurious high-rise apartment, gazing at the breathtaking city skyline, Ethan felt as if he were plummeting into an endless void, one that no amount of success could ever fill. Then one day everything came crashing down. Ethan's downfall didn't happen overnight, it was a slow, inevitable collapse, like a crack in a dam that grows wider with time. The warning signs had been there all along, but he had been too consumed by his ambitions to notice. At first it was just a subtle shift. He stopped calling his parents, dismissing their concerns as unnecessary distractions. He canceled plans with old friends, convincing himself that they no longer understood his life. He even distanced himself from colleagues, seeing them as nothing more than stepping stones or obstacles in his path. Relationships became transactional. Every interaction had to serve a purpose or it was a waste of his time. Then came the greed, an insatiable hunger that gnawed at him day and night. Ethan was no longer content with earning a high salary. He wanted to dominate the industry. He wanted his name to be on the front pages, his company to be the benchmark for success. So he started taking risks, reckless, desperate risks. He invested in shady ventures, ignored ethical concerns, and bent the rules wherever he could. As long as the numbers went up, he told himself, it would all be worth it. But numbers don't lie, and eventually the cracks became too deep to ignore. One morning, Ethan woke up to a barrage of messages and calls. A deal he had staked everything on had collapsed overnight. Millions were gone in an instant. Investors pulled out, partners distanced themselves, and within days the empire he had built with such ruthless determination crumbled to dust. Yet it wasn't just money he lost, it was everything. His reputation was in shambles. People who once respected him now avoided his calls. His colleagues whispered behind his back. His so-called friends, the ones who had laughed with him at high-end bars and exclusive clubs, disappeared the moment the champagne stopped flowing. Even his employees who had once admired his leadership, now looked at him with resentment, blaming him for their lost jobs. The real pain, however, wasn't external. It was the realization that, despite everything he had done, he was utterly alone. For the first time in years, Ethan had nothing left to chase. No deals to close, no goals to pursue, no distractions to keep his mind from facing the truth. He had spent so long running towards an illusion of success that he had lost sight of everything that truly mattered. And in that moment, standing alone in his empty apartment, staring at his own exhausted reflection, Ethan finally asked himself the question he had been avoiding for years. What have I become? Ethan had always thought of himself as invincible. No matter how many obstacles he faced, he believed he could outthink, outwork, and outmaneuver his way to the top. But this time there was no way out. After his financial collapse, he found himself drowning in lawsuits, debts, and public scrutiny. Everywhere he turned, there was judgment, online articles exposing his failures, whispers behind his back, investors demanding their money. Even stepping outside felt unbearable, as if the weight of his past mistakes was suffocating him. To numb the pain, Ethan turned to alcohol. What started as a drink or two to help him sleep soon became an everyday necessity. Mornings blurred into nights, and reality became something he no longer wanted to face. He moved through life in a haze, waking up in unfamiliar places, ignoring calls from the bank, and losing himself in temporary distractions that never truly dulled the ache inside him. But the lowest point came one rainy night. He had been drinking heavily at a bar, the same one he used to celebrate his victories. But this time there was no laughter, no friends, no toasts to success, just him and the empty glass in front of him. The bartender cut him off, but Ethan didn't care. Stumbling outside, he got into his car, his mind foggy, his hands unsteady. As he sped through the city streets, the flashing lights of oncoming cars blurred together. His thoughts were a chaotic mess, anger at the world, regret for his choices, and an overwhelming exhaustion that made him wish for just a moment that everything would stop. Then it happened. A sharp turn. A sudden swerve. The deafening screech of tires against wet pavement. And then, impact. Everything went black. ####, a harsh wake-up call. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was in a hospital bed. His body ached, his head throbbed, and his vision swam. But worse than the physical pain was the crushing realization of what he had done. He had nearly killed someone. A young man, just a college student, had been crossing the street when Ethan lost control. Miraculously, the student had only suffered minor injuries, but the weight of the incident hit Ethan like a ton of bricks. If things had been even slightly different, he could have taken a life. His mother sat by his bedside, her face lined with worry and disappointment. She didn't say much, just held his hand, tears in her eyes. It was the first time in years that Ethan truly looked at her, at the quiet pain he had caused her. For the first time in his life, he couldn't run from the consequences. Lying in that hospital bed, Ethan felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: guilt. Not just for the accident but for everything. The people he had hurt, the bridges he had burned, the way he had lost himself in an endless chase for more. Something inside him cracked. He realized he couldn't keep living like this. He had to change. He had to find himself again, if there was even anything left to find. And so, for the first time in his life, Ethan made a choice that wasn't about success, money, or status. He walked away from everything he once knew and set out on a journey, not to conquer the world but to finally understand himself. After being discharged from the hospital, Ethan did not return to his old life. He knew that if he continued down that path, he would once again be trapped in the cycle of ambition, mistakes, and suffering. Instead of trying to prove himself through material success, he decided to find a quiet place to confront himself. Ethan traveled to a rural village far from the city, a place where he could slow down, clear his mind, and reflect on everything that had happened. There he met an elderly monk who had seen many people like him. Those who had once been lost, had fallen, but still had the chance to change. The monk did not teach him through long lectures but through simple questions and silence. Gradually, Ethan learned profound lessons about right thinking, something he had never truly understood before. ####1. The mindset of letting go, learning to release desires ****. Ethan had once chased after luxury, money, power, fame. He believed that the more he had, the happier he would be. But now he realized that these desires had led him to the abyss. One day, the monk handed Ethan a cup full of water and asked him to hold it tightly. "How does it feel?" "Quite heavy," Ethan replied. "What if you keep holding it for a long time?" Ethan remained silent. "It's the same with your desires. The more you cling to them, the heavier they become and the more suffering they bring." For the first time, Ethan understood that happiness did not come from having more, but from knowing when to let go. He began to learn how to be content with what he had instead of constantly chasing things that would never be enough. ####2. The mindset of compassion. Learning to let go of resentment ****. One of the things that had trapped Ethan in misery was anger. He was angry at life's unfairness, at those who had turned their backs on him, and at himself. One day the monk asked him, "If someone throws a stone at you, what would you do?" Ethan frowned. "Dodge it or get angry and throw it back." "But if you just keep holding onto the stone and stay angry, who suffers the most?" Ethan had no answer. He realized that for so long, he had been clinging to resentment like a sharp stone, letting it weigh down his heart. But anger did not change the past, nor did it bring him peace. Ethan began practicing compassion, learning to forgive, not only others but also himself. He understood that everyone makes mistakes, that everyone gets lost sometimes. The key was to let go of the past and move forward. ####3. The mindset of non-harm, learning to live kindly ****. Ethan had once believed that hurting others was necessary to succeed in a competitive world. But after everything, he realized that the harm he caused would eventually return to him. One day the monk took him to a garden and gave him 2 types of seeds, one for flowers and one for weeds. Ethan planted them both and waited. After some time, the garden was overrun with weeds, while only a few flowers managed to bloom. "What do you see?" the monk asked. "Weeds grow faster than flowers," Ethan replied. "That's right," the monk smiled. "Negativity spreads more easily than goodness. If you are not mindful of your thoughts and actions, you will only sow negativity into your life." Ethan stood still, deep in thought. He realized that every word and action carried weight. If he wanted a better life, he had to start planting positive thoughts and deeds instead of being consumed by selfish ambitions. ####. A transformation from within. The months Ethan spent in the countryside changed him. He was no longer the man full of ambition and anger he once was. He learned to slow down, to think more carefully, and most importantly, to control his own mind. He returned to the city, but this time not to reclaim his former glory, but to live a different life. Ethan chose a simple job, spent his time helping those in need, and sought to live with more purpose. He understood that happiness did not come from external things, but from within. And now that he had realized this truth, he was lost no more. The day Ethan left the small village, the sky was clear and peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm inside him when he first arrived. The journey had helped him understand himself better, but life was not just an abstract lesson. It was a continuous flow, full of real challenges. He knew that no matter how valuable the lessons he had learned, if he didn't apply them, they would remain mere theories. Returning to the city, Ethan did not rush back into work as before. Instead, he took time to observe and immerse himself in the rhythm of life around him. The bustling streets, the hurried faces, the dreams torn between success and failure, everything was familiar, yet he was no longer the same person. #####. Facing the past. The first thing Ethan did was seek out those he had once hurt. Not everyone was ready to forgive him immediately, but what mattered was that he had learned to face his mistakes instead of avoiding them. Some listened, some still held on to their resentment, but Ethan no longer let his emotions dictate his actions. He understood that forgiveness didn't always come from others. Sometimes, it had to start from within. He also reached out to his family, whom he had been estranged from for years. The conversation wasn't easy, but for the first time in a long while, Ethan spoke without defensiveness or pride. He listened more, opened his heart more, and realized that his family had never truly turned their backs on him. He had simply shut them out for too long. #####. A simple but meaningful life. Instead of returning to high-status, high-profit jobs, Ethan chose a different path. He began working for a charity organization helping young people who had lost their way, people who reminded him of his past self. One day, a young man came to him, eyes filled with anger and despair. Ethan saw a reflection of himself in that gaze. He didn't give the boy a lecture, nor did he force him to change instantly. Instead, he simply listened and asked the same kind of questions his old master had once asked him. Slowly, the young man started to open up. Ethan realized that helping others was also a way to reinforce the lessons he had learned. Every time he shared his experiences, he understood them more deeply. #####. Happiness is not a destination, but a journey. One evening, as he sat on the small balcony of his modest apartment, Ethan looked up at the starry sky. For the first time in years, he felt a profound sense of peace. Life would always have its struggles and challenges, but this time he wouldn't let them consume him. He had learned to control his thoughts, to know when to let go, when to accept, and when to take action. Ethan smiled. He no longer sought a perfect version of himself. He just needed to be who he was, a man who had stumbled, fallen, but had risen again and continued to move forward.